Great. Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third lecture in the 2023 Royal Armouries Summer Lecture Series. As you can see, something a little bit different today, which is why we're a little bit late coming on. Apologies for that. But just to introduce myself, I'm Mark Bennett. I'm the museum's research manager, and thank you very much for joining us today. The Royal Armouries is the UK's national collection of arms and armour. We began as a medieval stockpile of weapons at the Tower of London, but it may surprise you just how long our involvement with the active business of warfare went on. In 1915, the then curator of the armouries, Charles Fuchs, was serving as a sub-lieutenant in an anti-aircraft battery when he opened fire against the German Zeppelin, making him the first ever person to fire a shot against a foreign enemy from the city of London. You can see the shell case that he fired at the Tower of London as part of our display related to the history of the site. You can also, if you're interested in the First World War, see the first ever Maxim machine gun at Leeds, or the massive 18-inch railway howitzer at Portsmouth. For details of all our sites and events, go to our website, which is royalarmouries.org. Today, however, you join us for the museum's Summer Lecture Series, which features contributions from those just starting out on their academic careers. If you missed the two previous talks in the series, the first one on firearms in the 16th century, the second one on Japanese armor, Bushido, and masculinity, they're both available to watch again on YouTube, as will this talk be if you unfortunately have to leave us before the end. If you're interested in the martial prowess of the early Roman Republic's Gallic opponents, or the use of fear by the pirates of the 17th century, sign up to our website to watch these talks via Zoom, or subscribe to our YouTube channel, where they'll appear live or as video on demand. After the event, we'll be taking questions from both the Zoom Q&A and the YouTube chat. So drop your questions in there, and I will ask them to our guest at the end of the talk. Can't guarantee to cover everything, but we will try and cover as many as we can. You can also add captions if you're hard of hearing. I think someone's done so already, but there's a CC button in both Zoom and YouTube that will get you those. Any technical problems, you've got the options to raise a hand, but often refreshing or leaving and rejoining will generally fix them. So with all the technical considerations, never mind. There we go. Perfect. Coming to you in live and surround, in technical and everything. So with all those technical considerations out of the way, let's come to today's event. The First World War still stands out in the public consciousness for the human cost of its technological advances, be that machine guns and rifles, siege howitzers and trench mortars, grenades, shotguns, flamethrowers, all took their toll. The recently introduced helmets, obviously which we have examples of, could protect the head and the brain, but they couldn't protect the rest of the body. So what was the end result of this new type of warfare, and how well did Britain, among other countries, cope with it? Well, to tell us more, we have Louise Bell. Louise is a third-year doctoral candidate at Leeds University, and I think it's fair to say has worked about as extensively as you can get on this project. So without any further ado, over to you, Louise.
Thank you, and thank you for the invite to present here today. This is pretty cool getting to present at the Royal Armouries, so thank you for that. So the decisive impact of the Great War on men's bodies can be seen most clearly by looking at the war maimed. Nearly 6 million British and German men were disabled by injury or by disease in these years, enduring wounds that the citizens at home would have found unimaginable. Shrapnel from exploding shells and bullets from machine gun fire destroyed the flesh of these men fighting and left behind some of the worst injuries ever seen. The only thing I dread is losing a limb. I'd far rather be killed, was a common cry amongst those fighting on the front lines. The fear of the helplessness that would come with losing a limb appears to be greater than that of losing one's life. This utter lack of precious independence, which the loss of a limb suggests, was something that could be dealt with. However, many men return from the battlefields with an arm or a leg, or sometimes both, missing, something which both the British government and health professions would have to deal with. Around 41,000 men returned to Britain missing one or more limbs, which equated to around 11,600 cases of lost arms and 29,400 cases of lost legs. Hospitals were set up to try and aid with the increasing number of limbless men who were being sent back to Britain. Numerous convalescent homes were also set up for those who were awaiting the fitting of artificial limbs. Men were not immediately sent to limb fitting centres after amputation. The stump had to have healed sufficiently in order to allow the attachment of prosthesis to it. But I will talk about that more later on in the lecture. These hospitals were mainly set up within various stately homes and country mansions, which were taken over for the duration of the conflict. But it was the opening of hospitals specifically to aid and care for those who needed new limbs and needed help with rehabilitation and the use of such limbs that were of great importance. Now, various hospitals, such as the Edinburgh War Hospital and Shepherd's Bush Military Hospital, had wards dedicated to such undertakings. But as the war continued, Britain began to see more specialist centres in military hospitals for limbless ex-servicemen opening in cities such as Leeds, Liverpool and Manchester. Yet it was the establishment of larger centralised limb fitting centres in each nation. So you've got the Princess Louise Scottish Hospital in Scotland, the Queen Mary Convalescent Auxiliary Hospital at Roehampton, the Prince of Wales Hospital in Wales, and the Ulster Volunteer Force Limbless Hospital in Belfast. These had some of the greatest impacts and became the focus of the aid for these limbless ex-servicemen. So this lecture will give some insight into these limb fitting centres and the work undertaken there, with particular focus on the rehabilitation offered and the artificial limbs given to these limbless ex-servicemen. Now, the First World War might have commenced months earlier, but it was when Mrs. Gwyn Halford, one of the founders of the hospital at Roehampton, when she visited one of the wards at the Millbank Military Hospital in January 1915, that the true human sacrifice of the war became apparent to her. It was here that the inspiration to open such a hospital was born. Gwyn Halford describes spotting a man who was sitting at a table with a look of utter sadness and hopelessness on his face, a man who had lost both arms. On the table in front of him rested the two leather sockets with hooks attached, which the government had supplied as a substitute for what he had lost. Conversing with him, his response to her questioning about what had happened to him was, I quote, "Is this all my country can do for me?" These words lit the spark of determination within Gwyn Halford, and she vowed that she would work for one object, and that was to start a hospital whereby all those who had the misfortune to lose a limb in this terrible war could be fitted with those most perfect artificial limbs human science could devise. This vow was what both the hospital at Roehampton and its Scottish counterpart in Erskine and all of the nations were determined to undertake. Speaking at a public meeting in March 1916, Sir William McEwen, the eminent surgeon and one of the founders of the hospital in Scotland, stated that the object and purposes of the hospital at Erskine would be to receive and treat men who have lost their limbs or who have faulty use of their injured limbs after their discharge from the general hospitals, and to fit the limbless with artificial limbs and teach them how to use them. That he mentions teaching these patients how to use the new limbs is of great importance, as rehabilitation was an area in which all of these hospitals strive to excel in. Now, the creation and maintenance of Roehampton as a limb fitting centre was due to the public spirit and foresight of its founders, Gwyn Halford, Lady Falmouth and Charles Kenderdine, as well as due to the generosity of the public as a whole. Appeals were made to the public in order to drum up support and funds for the opening and maintenance of the hospital. And by June 1915, donations totaling just over 19,000 had been subscribed to the hospital fund. The owner of Roehampton House agreed to lend the house to the committee rent-free, as well as 30 acres of land surrounding the house. As I said, the house itself was a stately mansion, and the grounds and the settings would play a more significant role in regards to the rehabilitation of these men. It allowed space for recreational pursuits and for workshops to be set up. In her writing of the history of Roehampton, Helen Alper argues that without the amalgamation of different interests from the armed services to orthopaedic surgeons and representatives from relevant government departments to major charities that donated money, the hospital would never have been able to make the transition from a mere auxiliary hospital to a national institution. The grants and donations offered by these various groups, as well as the support for obtaining the house, were fundamental to the success of Roehampton, and Queen Mary expressing the desire to become patron of the hospital was definitely another boost for the institution as well. Now, there was one issue with the foundation of the hospital at Roehampton, and that was raised by those in Scotland. Although praising the advantages of limbless ex-servicemen now being able to have their artificial limbs properly fitted and adjusted, a letter written in the Scotsman on the 8th of July 1915 raised the point that such care was not as easily accessible to those men living in Scotland if the only place they could be treated was Roehampton. So the suggestion was raised that the scheme already in place down in London should be extended to Scotland, and that a committee could be set up in order to undertake such a challenge. The scale of casualties made it obvious that a large hospital was needed in Scotland to deal with such injuries, and that's why we also see one opening in Wales and Northern Ireland throughout the war as well. There was already a hospital at Eden Hall in Scotland, but it was known that they would not be able to cope with the requirements needed to deal with the numerous limbless patients. An account of the founding of the hospital Erskine states that it was suggested that Sir William McEwen, the eminent surgeon with his great influence, could render more effective help than anyone else. So obviously there's a lot of meetings happening around this, but it was strong-willed McEwen that actually made action happen with this. And with the surgeons of Glasgow, they made the first official move to actually getting the starting of this hospital underway. And like with what happened at Roehampton, the project gained even more headway after Princess Louise agreed to become patron of the hospital and added prestige with her name being borne by the institution as well. And again, like we see happening at Roehampton, the owner of the mansion house at Erskine offers the committee free use of the house and the surrounding gardens for the duration of the war and for 12 years after peace was declared. Again, the announcement of the plans for the hospital was met by an eager response from the public, much like what we saw at Roehampton. Within a few weeks of the announcement, the Scottish public had donated £100,000 towards the hospital. Hundreds of gifts flooded in as well, ranging from pianos to a billiard table to typewriters and numerous articles of furniture. The conversion of this new house, this house into this new hospital, as well as sorting through all of those gifts, took longer than expected. There was also wartime shortages in labour and materials. So this had an impact on the speed at which the conversion could take place. But on the 10th of October 1916, Erskine Hospital opened its doors to the war wounded. Now, hospitals placed a huge emphasis on rehabilitation. Now, rehabilitation usually took the form of two strands: sport and recreation, or employment. So playing sport was one manner in which these men could subscribe to the norms of society. There was also the added bonus of higher fitness levels achieved through sport and the social aspect of getting together with other people and just enjoying an activity such as football. Many of these men had to remain in hospital for lengthy periods of time. So the chance to play a sport was one manner of breaking up the monotony of ward life. Sport had also been part of service life as well. Again, it maintained fitness levels, enforced discipline, and allowed for the idea of being part of a team to grow. Now, these men could play anything from football to cricket to golf while they were in these hospitals. Not just for fun, it also allowed the men to practice using their new limbs. Exercising also allowed the semblance of normality, but it also, as I said, gave them time to practice and get used to things like balance and the new equilibrium needed to walk effectively while having this bit of metal or wood attached to their body. One man believed that he was wise in concentrating on games during his convalescence, as they gave me back confidence in myself and new health and strength. However, there were men who were willing to express the negative and probably more truthful side of losing a limb and how it affected their activeness. One ex-serviceman lamented the loss of his leg during the war because his main recreations were swimming and walking. Now, he could still swim, but believed that walking is no fun to a man with an artificial leg, which feels, when he is tired, as if it were a ton in weight. That the man could still swim is obviously a commendation for the help offered, but the length of distance required to make him feel so tired while walking isn't stated. So if he's going for a massive hike, then fair enough. But if he was just getting tired while walking down the street, then this could serve to question the limb that he was given and the training that was afforded to him with regards to the ease of using this new limb. And interestingly, the hospital set up in Wales had a golf course on it, which had bunkers, bridges and stiles, which was erected for the use of the amputees situated there. And that's because it's such different terrains. They're not just practicing walking up and down a hall all day, which obviously isn't the natural way of walking around anyway. So that was a very sort of clever idea on their part. Now, workshops were also erected in the grounds of these hospitals in order to try and aid these men with finding employment. and decent employment at that once they had left the wards. So not just intended as a forward-looking scheme, the workshops were detailed with the task of employing the spare time of those waiting for treatment at the hospital in useful and remunerative work. A large, substantially built building located to the southwest of the house at Erskine was turned into a workshop, and within it was split into 3 sections, which housed rooms of different trade themes. Everything from shoemaking to hairdressing to gardening and tailoring was taught at Erskine. 24 trades in total were available at Roehampton, including motor and electrical engineering, carpentry, accountancy, shorthand, and typewriting. Now, both the sports and the employment aspects are very important parts of the rehabilitation journey. But one important step always seems to be glossed over when talking about this. What about that initial learning to actually use a limb, as I've said, adapting to having this new piece of wood or metal attached to their body? There's a whole series of processes that these men had to go through, taking them from amputation to being able to play sport or do some work. And you can see that on the screen just now, the sort of 4 steps they would have to go through before they could miraculously go out and play football. Again, so I'm going to explain these in a little bit more detail in this section of the lecture. So the initial trauma that all ex-servicemen went through in some form was that of amputation. Often hurriedly undertaken near the front lines, medical staff played a huge role in dealing with these amputation sites once a man was returned home to Britain. Others had to go undergo amputations once back home due to wounds becoming infected and other complications from disease and injury. Even undergoing this initial amputation did not necessarily signal the end of the surgical interventions for these men. Hastily undertaken amputations at the front in particular likely required more medical care and surgical intervention in hospitals across Britain. Skin flaps had to be the perfect length for creating a healthy stump, and bones and nerves might also have to be further operated on. As I said, alongside this was the constant risk of infection, which would cause more complications in itself. So reamputation was not uncommon. And all of this was in order to create the perfect stump for a prosthesis to be attached to later in the ex-serviceman's journey. As I said previously, many of these ex-servicemen would spend time in military hospitals before being transferred to the limb fitting centres. And here they would once again spend more time on hospital wards. This need for medical intervention and re-intervention is one of the reasons why the overall limb fitting and rehabilitation process was such a lengthy one. The disabled ex-serviceman couldn't just simply be given an artificial limb and be sent on his way. Now, the doctors and the surgeons obviously played this pivotal role when it came to the actual amputation or their subsequent operations. However, they also held the power over when a man could be officially sent for the fitting of his new artificial limb. If the stump had not healed properly or if further complications arose, these professionals could delay the next step. Naturally, it was of the utmost use to have medical staff around to deal with any of these complications. And this can be seen in parallel with the importance of having proper fitters and instructors on hand, which I'm about to talk about in a minute. Having staff on site to deal with these problems as they arose is one of the benefits of these limb fitting centres. Having everyone involved in the process under one roof is sort of a big thing to take away from this here. Now, once a stump was deemed to be sufficiently healed, the ex-serviceman could move on to the next stage in the rehabilitation process, and that was being fitted for an artificial limb. Now, the actual fitting of an artificial limb was essentially the whole purpose of these limb fitting centres. To have these spaces where these ex-servicemen could go and be given the proper attention required to find a properly fitting limb, and one that would be of most use and comfort to them, was paramount. Speaking during the First World War, the artificial limb maker Rowley stated that the limbs are made under the men. The idea was that each man would leave the limb fitting centre with a limb that was perfect for him and that would have been crafted to his needs and proportions. This is where both the skills of the fitters and the makers were of the utmost importance. As well as ensuring that the ex-serviceman received the best fit of limb, these limb fitters also had some say and expertise in the types of limbs on offer in these limb fitting centres. As I've said, an ex-serviceman could not be efficiently fitted for a limb until the stump had properly healed and shrunk to the size that it was going to remain. Now, relating to this is one account of an ex-serviceman who was being treated at Roehampton during the First World War, which concerns the fitting of an artificial leg and how the whole process was for him. So after a few weeks of trying to wear the leg, the man in question has to be seen by the officer in charge as complaints of a pain in the back of his stump each time he attempted to keep the limb on were becoming really common. So this discomfort while wearing the limb appears to be a common occurrence for him and affects his relationship with using the prosthesis that he's been offered. Now, later in his account of his time here, he is once again complaining of pain in the stump. At this point, according to his account, the medical officer believes that he is lying and that the ex-serviceman is not actually making any attempt to wear his artificial leg and actually acclimatise to it. Therefore, as a result of this medical expertise, he continues to wear the leg until his stump becomes so inflamed that he just can't actually attach the leg at all and actually use it. Now, this account suggests some of the issues that could arise in this sort of initial stage when giving a new prosthesis that I've talked about already, especially with regards to the proper fitting of a limb and waiting for the stump to be properly healed. I mean, it doesn't paint the staff in a particularly favourable light, but it's still interesting to see someone who'd undergone treatment at arguably the largest of the limb fitting centres in the First World War. The experience with how wearing an ill-fitting prosthesis was affecting the stump of the ex-serviceman in question does offer more insight into this difficult side of this rehabilitation journey. Now, wearing a prosthesis was something that these men were having to adapt to in every sense of the word, and ill-formed or even sensitive stumps were part of this challenge. I mean, even today, with much more advanced prostheses, comfort in wearing an artificial leg, in particular for long periods of time, is still an issue. There's also the issue of pressure being placed on this wounded area and causing a multitude of problems, like the ex-serviceman in the anecdote was experiencing. Once again, this highlights the importance of these limb fitting centres being spaces where various staff could work together to try and resolve some of these issues, or at least lessen their impact. Now, the last of these initial steps in the rehabilitation process was learning to adapt to wearing this new prosthesis and testing what a man could do with his new limb, which is where limb instructors come into play. Now, the need for instructors for artificial limbs became very clear as the First World War continued to rage on and more men were being fitted with prostheses. Arm instructors in particular were the priority when discussions were being had between the limb fitting centres, the Ministry of Pensions and the Treasury. Now, these instructors were to be men who had lost limbs themselves. Ideally, they would have only lost one limb and would be proficient in the use of their own prosthesis in order to be able to show the ex-servicemen what could be done with their artificial arms or legs. The instructors themselves were to be hired on a full-time basis, and it isn't until 1919 that we really start to see these instructors in place, though. It comes pretty late into the war that they realise the need for this proper instruction in artificial limbs. So I'm going to tell you about what would happen at Roehampton in the arm instruction school. So there's quite a lot of documentation about that. So upon entering Roehampton, the limbless ex-serviceman was sent to the chief arm instructor, who would show them around the school and explain the various types of arms available. This tour also allowed the man to ask any questions he might have about the process and about the various different arms that he could choose from. It also allowed the instructor to question the man about the line of work he hoped to pursue, and he could then suggest what he thought was the most suitable arm for the ex-serviceman in question. After all this immediate conversation had taken place, the ex-serviceman had a consultation with the surgeon to examine his stump again and make sure it was suitable for an artificial arm to be attached to it. Once all of this had been undertaken, the instructor, the surgeon, and the ex-serviceman himself would decide together what they thought was the best arm for the man. So the biggest advantage to all of this was that the man in question now had some choice in the arm that he'd be using from then on. This choice was also backed up by the expertise of those who were involved from the limb fitting centre side of things, therefore not allowing the ex-serviceman to make a wildly inappropriate choice of arm for himself and his future plans. This process would be followed once more when he returned for a second or duplicate limb, which is something all limbless ex-servicemen got during the First World War. By the time of renewal, many of the prostheses previously used had become obsolete, so it was important that information about these newer prostheses could be provided. In terms of artificial legs and the sort of training in that, you couldn't leave the hospital without that, so that was all part of the sort of fitting process. If the man couldn't walk with it, then you obviously couldn't actively leave the hospital, so that's why this instruction on arms is sort of more important, because you could leave the hospital missing an arm and not using a prosthetic limb. Now, those involved with the setting up and running of these training programs at this initial stage went to great lengths to make sure that the work undertaken there was functional and not vocational. Essentially, their job was to give training in using prostheses that would mimic as close as possible to the normal function as what would have been done with their original limb. Being able to go about everyday life was their primary goal, and proficiency in the use of the artificial arm is primary. Obviously, once they'd been through this initial training, they could go back to these workshops that I talked about previously near the start of the talk. Now, this is probably a section that you're probably waiting for me to get talking about, and that is actually the prostheses themselves. So the First World War definitely made the need for a strong prosthetic limbs industry in Britain very apparent. Now, that isn't to say that such an industry didn't already exist here. Accidents and injuries in the workplace in particular meant that a well-developed market for artificial limbs had already been established. However, the First World War brought with it a larger concentration of men in a relatively short period of time. As I said previously, around 41,000 ex-servicemen returned from the war missing limbs. Now, speaking at a public meeting in March 1916, Sir William McEwen, the surgeon and one of the founders of Erskine, expressed his dissatisfaction at what he saw as an apparent dependence on foreign limb makers in Britain, and stated that even if Scotland was left without any professional limb makers, he had every confidence in the potentiality of Glasgow in terms of actually making these limbs. It was upon the shipbuilders of Glasgow that McEwen and the staff at Erskine called upon in order to help aid them with the manufacturing of prosthetic limbs. Not just aiding by giving practical and valuable advice, these men were able to help with the production of artificial limbs of sufficient quantity and of quality to satisfy our requirements by employing home industry alone. The hope was to continue this practice of employing native Scottish limb makers by training some of those who had received these limbs so that they could aid in the making of limbs for those who would inevitably follow them. Harold Yarrow in particular was of great assistance to the Erskine cause. He lent his yard's technical assistance as well as some of his best craftsmen to help with the manufacturing of new limbs. Later in 1918, two more firms, the Anchor Line and Sir William Arrell and Co. joined Yarrow in this manufacturing. Now, willow was found to be the most suitable wood for making limbs, at least early on in the war. The limbs being made at Roehampton, which were not constructed from willow, were being discovered to be too heavy. As a result, the countryside was scoured for willows, and any found were usually taken without any thought to what the owner desired to happen to them. A well-known story regards McEwen and the 5 willow trees that were growing in the grounds of the University of Glasgow. McEwen asked the principal of the university if it would be acceptable to use the willows, to which the latter responded that he could see no reason why there'd be any issue with that. So basically, McEwen just stole the willows and made limbs out of them, essentially. So eventually, McEwen devised a full set of limbs that would meet practically every need of the men that needed these limbs. He believed it was to be of great importance that the artificial limb provided was not merely for aesthetic purposes. McEwen himself designed these Erskine provisional limbs, which were described as masterpieces of lightness and simplicity at the time. Now, workshops for the manufacture of every variety of artificial limb were erected on the grounds of the house at Roehampton too. Now, Roehampton appreciated that the limb making industry in Britain was on a small scale for the current demand, but they did not look to just using native limb makers. In order to keep to the promise of supplying the best limbs that could be constructed, an exhibition was held at Roehampton House from the 20th to the 23rd of July 1915, to which 3 American firms were invited to send representatives. These firms were Carn of Kansas City, Hanger from Ohio, and Rowley of Chicago. It was determined that it would be of best interest to establish the limb makers on the actual site of Roehampton so as to maximise production. Some firms were initially housed in the basement of Roehampton House, although huts were soon provided for these men because there was just so much pressure for more and more limbs, so they needed more space. But it wasn't just these 3 American companies that had workshops on site. British limb makers such as Blatchford did also have tenancy agreements for huts in the hospital grounds. So I'm going to show you some examples of limbs. So the limb on screen just now shows a right below knee leg made at Erskine, Both the socket and the thigh corset, so that's the sort of top part of the limb there, are made from 3-ply wood, which was chosen because of its thin and adjustable nature, making it easier to adapt to the stump of the man. As I said, that's such an important part. You can see a sort of very basic knee joint there as well in the middle. And the foot itself has what was called a clapper style joint. And this kind of made walking look as natural as possible, but it did also mean that the foot made a noise when the man was walking. So that naturalness was kind of taken away by the sort of noise that was accompanying him. So this is obviously an example from Erskine. This was one of the provisional limbs that Sir William McEwen was manufacturing at the time. Now, as we start to move further into the war, we start to see experimentation with different materials. A lot of light metal is being used. The sockets start to be made from a material called certomid, which is sort of compound that's much lighter than the wood that was previously being used. And on screen just now, you can see an example of an artificial foot that's using wood, but it's also felt, fibers, and other materials on there as well. Just give you an idea of sort of experimentation that's happening. I mean, this is coming from sort of 1919, 1920. We start to see this as well. This period also brings with it the idea of standardization. A lot of men start to get worried about the thought of limbs being manufactured in a sort of factory process. They're worried that they won't have that sort of one limb fits perfectly for him, but that wasn't what was actually happening. It was the sort of mass manufacturing of individual parts of limbs, not the whole limb itself. A man would still be properly fitted for it. It's just there were so many manufacturers working at these various limb fitting centres across the country at the time that it was difficult, especially when it came to repairs, to get them done quickly. So having these standardised parts of limbs made repairs easier, meant that a man had his limb back a lot faster, and hospital time also was down as well. Now, speaking about sort of that adaptation, this limb on screen now is from the Science Museum collections, and it's again from the later part of the First World War. And this is also made from light metal. The Ministry of Pensions commissioned this to be manufactured. And I just think, compared to that wooden limb that I showed you previously, it's a stunning piece of sort of engineering. I mean, you can almost see the muscles on the leg. It's much lighter than the wooden limb. You could see why men might prefer that to the wooden limbs that they were being offered previously. Also, again, shows you why, when they went back to being fitted, they had to be shown these new limbs and shown how to use them, because it was a much different beast from what they'd previously been given. Now, I've talked a lot about legs there, so I thought I'd show you an example of an artificial arm as well. I'm still kind of wrapping my head around how the arms work. They're not as easy as the legs, I guess. So there's just so much you could do with an arm, or you might need to do with an artificial arm. So this is from Thackeray Medical Museum here in Leeds. Again, it's made of metal. And what's interesting about this, it's for a below elbow right amputation. You can see in the box, hopefully, there's lots of sort of attachments and other bits in there, not just the arm itself. Now, when this arm was given out, initially, you get a hook with it that's attached to the end of it, and that would be the same length as your other arm. I guess to make it easy to use, you're not off balance. I guess there's a sort of an aesthetic purpose to that as well. But more interestingly are the attachments. Now, when being given an artificial arm, you were normally given a nail brush, the hook, and those were the sort of main priorities. But depending on what trade you wanted to do, you could be given an attachment that would help you with that. So there's a typewriting tool there to help you typewrite. There's a bit to attach on to sort of broom handles, wheelbarrows, you know, sort of common tools that men were using in everyday sort of trades that they were going back to. You had to prove that you needed these attachments, because initially they realised that men were just taking any attachment they wanted with them and then just weren't using them. And economically, that wasn't great for the government. So yeah, you had to kind of prove that you needed that for the trade that you were doing, but you'd always get that nail brush. You'd always have that sort of hook with it as well to use it. I mean, nail brush also links back to that sort of, there's a cleanliness, again, it also links back to the sort of service period as well. So yeah, I think this is a very exciting limb. I love it. So yeah, obviously, as I said, that's kind of a very sort of quick run through of limbless ex-servicemen in the First World War. These hospitals continued well on into the interwar period. men, obviously there's long waiting lists for these men to go through the hospitals. They had to go back for repairs, refittings, potential other operations. There was a constant need for them, and you see them still doing what they're doing up until the 1930s. Then some of them start to change purpose, but Erskine and Roehampton in particular do remain for ex-servicemen. Roehampton remains as a limbless hospital throughout the First and Second World War. Erskine starts to transition into sort of any disabled ex-serviceman and becomes what it is today. Erskine still exists today and is still caring for ex-servicemen and ex-service women. So this is just a bit of an insight into that sort of initial work that these hospitals were doing and what they were doing for these limbless ex-servicemen in the First World War. Thank you. Yes.
I do have a low battery warning, but that hopefully is slightly better. How's that? Sorry about that, everyone. Technical issues. I mean, this is fascinating, but also somewhat harrowing. And I wonder about the people who work in these hospitals. Do they see it as a generally positive experience that they're helping someone, or is the sheer volume of stuff that comes through, does it stay with them after the war?
Do you know what? I've not really come across any accounts of the staff per se. I mean, it's very rare, apart from unless you're an eminent surgeon or the chief arm instructor at Roehampton, it's very rare you're actually named in the records. So I mean, there'd be all of these nurses, all of these other men, even the limb fitters, I don't actually know enough about them because they're just not there in the records or in the accounts, unfortunately. So I don't think I can answer that question. I mean, because it's just, if anybody knows where I can find stuff, please let me know.
So one for the postdoc.
Yeah.
Sorry, Laurie, do we need to reorient camera? Sorry about that. Again, you know, this is a learning process for all. If you do have any feedback, please do let us know. Probably the best place inquiries at royalarmouries.org. But you know, in terms of their end user experience, we're fascinated because we would love to do more stuff like this. But it's just not, having that personal interaction just isn't quite the same online. Now, we've mentioned, you know, people being shocked by the sheer volume of people coming through. Andrew Sock had a question about whether people who had relatively simple needs were treated fairly quickly while other people were sort of hanging around waiting for a while, or is the case that they're trying to get people through at roughly the same rate for everyone?
It looks like they're trying to get people through at roughly the same rate for everyone. I guess it depends on when you were injured, how long it took you to get back to Britain. Obviously, initially, everybody's trying to go through Roehampton, which is a nightmare because it's one institution. There's only so much they can do, which is why this need for space constantly creeps up. So I think it gets slightly easier once you open up the sort of 4 nation limb fitting centres. But yeah, I mean, some men could be in hospital for a couple of days. Some men spent months upon months. It's awful when you look at their sort of like the pension records. These men, and you've seen them like just constantly in and out of hospital, spending 24 weeks in Roehampton because something's went wrong, can't adapt their limb, or if they're missing more than one limb as well, that's just a whole different ball game as well. So a lot of this is focused on you just having lost one limb. So yeah, it really depends. I mean, also I think there's probably some reluctance for men to go to the hospital, depending, because even if you've got Roehampton, what if you're based in Leeds? I mean, I know there is the military hospital here, but you're wanting to go to Roehampton, aren't you? That's the limb fitting centre, but that's a trek. Like, there's a lot of things like that. I think there's a lot of things that need to be taken into consideration. It isn't just that sort of medical side of it, and it kind of relates to how long treatment could take for some men.
So, I mean, you may have to repeat the question just so everyone can see, but I was curious, but do we know how people felt about being photographed in a very vulnerable state of undress, using it potentially as propaganda?
Yeah, so the photographing of these men is something I've been considering a lot. Me and one of my main supervisors have been kind of discussing this. Again, I've not really seen anyone talking about it. I think what's interesting is obviously I've said ex-servicemen throughout, and for the First World War it is men predominantly. Yes. But I'm just going to shift to the Second World War slightly because I do also look at that. You've got a lot more women that are needing to go to these limb fitting centres, and they have separate rooms. There's sort of a lot more privacy once you realize that women are involved in that sort of state of it. So I mean, you're unlikely to see you're never going to see a woman photographed in that state. Whereas like, yeah, there's quite a few images of men standing, especially for like legs just in their pants. And again, a lot of it is in sort of like catalogs kind of showing off the limbs and that. So we don't really know how these men feel because their voices haven't been recorded, have they? They're just showing off this cool new wooden leg that they've been given, and that's what the advertisers and the manufacturers want to show off. So it is, I always do feel a bit iffy when I'm looking at these images. I mean, obviously it's great to see how you hear that it's attached with a strap. I mean, that means nothing until you actually see that. It's very beneficial from my point of view, but yeah, those men.
Yeah. But something that's common to anything to do with war, really, you're seeing someone's very private, vulnerable moments.
Exactly.
And in some cases, we're using them as displays on the wall for people to understand more about. And I think that's the key, is understanding.
Yeah, I hope that was the kind of a lot of the point behind it.
Although by mentioning the photo of people in their underwear, the Imperial War Museum, the one we used to advertise the talk, so we've got a question from Richard Stableford. There's a make sure your shoes are mates. Do we know what mates meant, or is that lost to time?
This is the second time I've been asked this question after using that image. I'm going to stop using it now. Again, I'm not 100% sure, but I think a lot of it's probably to do with the fact that the foot had to be the same size as your sort of natural foot that you had, so you can't. I think that there's a lot of play on that. More than it's like, I mean, yes, you probably could put a shoe on top of the limb, but how often that was happening, I'm not 100% sure. So I'm not 100% sure on that. I need to answer a question properly at some point here. So many questions for the last year of this PhD. But yeah, that's
always the way.
I know that's the second time someone's put it. I'm becoming mildly obsessed with the idea of shoes now.
I'll throw you a nice easy one again from Richard. Were there any prosthetic centres in the southwest, e.g. Bristol? Again, is everyone coming up to Roehampton?
I know that there was a limb manufacturer based in Somerset. Is kind of the sort of further south I can think of something. And it's likely that if there was a military hospital there was probably a small ward dedicated to that. Most military hospitals had something, but for the sort of, if you wanted that proper limb fitting, you were going to Roehampton or going to Cardiff. Probably your two closest at that point. Yeah.
And a question from Katerina online, which I mentioned because you said that German stuff was fairly well studied. Was there any discussion among the designers or fitters about what other countries are doing at the same time? Any technical examples coming over?
So Britain works closely with obviously the United States because they've had the Civil War, so they're very well versed in how to make artificial limbs. And I've seen conversations with manufacturers in France, obviously our closest ally in the war. But I haven't really seen much discussion on if we're wondering what the Germans are up to. I mean, the German side of things is very much get them back to work. It's very practical, artificial limbs. Aesthetics don't really matter at all in Germany from what I've read. Whereas obviously we're seeing some of that in Britain, but not to the same extent. But I haven't really seen much discussion of us spying on the Germans, see what they're up to, or chatting to them about that. It is very much our allies that we're working with on that front.
I was curious because there's been, a lot of these bodies are charities. There's mention of the Department of Pensions, etc., Ministry of Pensions rather. Who decides what's getting purchased? Is it because of anyone who's got a reasonable design is coming to someone and getting it made, or is there something more systematic in place?
So once the Ministry of Pensions starts up in 1916, they take control of this. Obviously, these limb fitting centres were set up, the main two that I talked about initially, through philanthropic means. And that's why you see Scotland kind of working so closely with what they've got and the shipbuilders for the artificial limbs. But once the Ministry of Pensions take over, they kind of look at all of the limb makers. They essentially employ limb makers, especially to Roehampton. Roehampton starts to work very closely with the state once the Ministry of Pensions comes into existence, and it's kind of them that are deciding that. And that's when things start to get interesting, when all of this sort of experimentation with light metals starts to come in towards the end of the war. So obviously all the manufacturers have been working there for years, or very much they work with wood. That's what they've always done. So you see kind of them talking to the Ministry of Pensions to try and avoid kind of employing these new cool metal limb manufacturers. But obviously, eventually, management realised that actually the metal limbs last longer. They don't need as many repairs. So a lot of that, from their point of view, is that sort of economical side of things. So yeah, Scotland kind of always kind of works as a sort of philanthropic thing. They kind of have a say on who the kind of board of the hospital has a say on who's being employed as a manufacturer, where they're getting the limbs from. And Wales is very closely attached to Roehampton, so they kind of work the same in that respect.
Your mention of the American Civil War intrigued me, because it's, you know, we always talk about the First World War, and no one really predicted how it was going to turn out. Was even based on things like the Russo-Japanese War, was there really no expectation that there would be a greater demand for this, or was it just a case of they foresaw it, but it wasn't sufficient?
It feels like they just didn't expect it. I think it's I think it is, as we're seeing all these sort of new weapons that are being used, and the dirt on the battlefields. Well, just basically, first of all, they get very amputation happy. I think would be a phrase to use. Second World War, they've realised a bit from the mistakes, and there's a lot less men and women losing limbs, because they realise that they can actually, you know, fix the broken part potentially instead of just lopping off on the front lines. I think there's a bit of a panic on the front lines, especially when those like first amputations are happening. So then you sent all these men back missing a body part, so somebody has to deal with it, don't they? And I don't think they expected it on the level that 41,000 men throughout the war itself. You're looking at sort of half that in the Second World War, because they've just they've realised that, you know, there are ways of dealing with injuries and disease and all of that by that point. But I think they're just not there in the First World War with that. That's
fascinating, because the kind of the hasty amputation as, oh, this is the only thing that you sort of think of it in the Napoleonic Wars, but you always assume that the First World War they're somewhat more advanced.
I know, and it's and even the fact that it takes until, well, you're a year into the war before you realise that actually we need to look into these limbless ex-servicemen and actually do something for them, instead of, because previously if you were getting an artificial limb, a lot of time it was just you see in a catalogue, order through the post, send your measurements off, manufacturer make it, there you go. So I mean, I have to wonder if there's a whole that kind of like, well, these men have done this for the country in this sort of big scale. It's a world war, isn't it? Well, the Great War for them at the time and stuff like that. So is that why these centres were opened up as well? Because they needed to do something, didn't they, to, or at least show they were doing something to help them.
And it's sort of the stage before your sort of your main, you know, the main area that you're looking at. But I was wondering about the surgical prognosis type stuff. Like, are they? You mentioned they were perhaps amputation happy. Are they actually killing a lot of people on the front line as a result of that, or actually are amputations safe enough that they can, you know, almost it's better than the alternative of trying to treat it in an era before antibiotics?
I don't know. I've not actually, it's going to be something for the introduction of the thesis now, isn't it? I've not actually kind of looked into the success rate of amputations on the front lines. I guess I've probably done that terrible thing of just taking it for granted that men were coming back with, like, I care more about when they're actually in Britain. That's my problem.
Well, one tied into that. So we had a question from S-Jagdish online. Do we have any information on how many individuals with prosthesis returned to military service?
So initially, there's this grand plan that once a man was fitted with his new arm or leg, he could be sent back to the front lines. Obviously, they realised very quickly that that's not going to happen, especially with that sort of lack of training that I was talking about as well. So once you've been fitted with your artificial limb, most men were taken out of service. Nobody went back to fight. Nobody really went back to even like a at-home military job. You weren't in the military anymore. You were discharged eventually. It could take a wee while, but you would be discharged from the military at that point.
Yeah, although I imagine later in the war, they're also struggling with having sufficient people in the factories to produce them. So anyway, hence, you know, women going into the workforce.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, some men, also a lot of men went back to some form of employment, but it was more sort of easy work, I guess. And I guess a lot of it was what they felt quite like feminine jobs as well. So I guess that kind of links to that. They might have been able to go back and work in factories and stuff like that. But I mean, men are going back down the mines and that with their artificial limbs. So I mean, depending on how well you adapted to it, and I guess how stubborn you were, so I think a lot of that plays a part in it.
We did have a question, Alderan, I think it is on YouTube. How much the prosthetics improved during World War II? Now, I believe your doctorate spreads it into World War II, so I don't mind asking.
So, interestingly, and this is kind of thing I've been kind of trying to like think about a lot at the moment. I think this might actually be what my thesis is about, is that a lot of the sort of advances happen in the interwar period. So in that sort of peacetime, I guess. And once you hit the Second World War, the limbs don't look a lot different from what you were using in the sort of 1920s, 1930s. I mean, you've still got that light metal, you've still got that materials like Sertomed and those lighter sort of materials being used in that. So there isn't, from what I've seen in museum collections, there's a lot less of Second World War stuff than there is First World War. There aren't, all the big changes happen in the interwar period, and they just kind of strangely stay the same for the Second World War. So a lot of time when you think of the Second World War, you'd be like, did they forget what happened in the First World War? Whereas actually, in terms of the limb fitting centres and how they're treating limbless ex-servicemen and the prostheses, there's a lot of continuation from the interwar period into the Second World War, and it's all kind of there for them. So that the change doesn't really happen then, it happens in the interwar period.
I've got a couple more questions. If anyone's got any online, please do let us know, and I'll try and fit them in. But I had a couple myself.
Okay.
I mean, again, on the World War II front, you mentioned that there are far fewer amputations. We talk about the, them stockpiling cardboard coffins that never get used because they're mispredicted. They also kind of stockpiling, hundreds of thousands of wooden legs for amputees, and then actually they're never needed, or are they doing it on more on a just-in-time basis?
They're doing it more on a just-in-time basis, from what I can see. So again, like interesting, I mean, especially about the instructors. I mean, again, they always forget about them and stuff like that, but they don't, because there's so few. They're kind of, I guess, there's more room to kind of make the perfect limb for people on that. But again, they don't bring instructors back in until the middle of the Second World War, because there just haven't been, especially arm cases. There seems to be a lot more leg cases every time. So I think there is sort of more space for them to just have that sort of, they're not wasting materials per se. So they're building it for the man or the women. So obviously we've got a lot more sort of bombing raids happening here, women actually in the services and that. I don't know anything about prosthetic limbs for women. It just doesn't come up at all. And there must have been different ones. So again, if anyone knows anything and wants to like give me a shout about that, I'm just using this to plug my own questions myself now. But yeah, like Roehampton is the sort of only, I mean, you get smaller hospitals around the country again, but Erskine's kind of adapted to elsewhere. Hospital in Wales has become something else. So Roehampton is where everybody is technically going in the Second World War. But yeah, they're building them. I mean, they've probably got parts stockpile, but not the actual limbs themselves. And
my final question is a slightly envious one, because the nature of the nature of our collection is we've got a lot of objects that don't necessarily link through to individuals.
Yep.
Now the artificial limbs that we've seen in various different museum collections, fascinating objects. Are they linked to individual donors who no longer need them, have passed them to museums, or are they kind of exemplars of construction types, or do we simply not know? Is it not the problem?
So the ones that I've showed, I don't obviously know who the manufacturers are, but I don't know who used them. The Science Museum in particular have a few that you can see, at least the sort of, and they've got stories attached to them when they came in. And there's one that a man who used to work on like roofs and that has kind of repaired his own leg with cement, because it's materials he understands. It's a wooden leg, but you can see the repairs that he's done to it himself, and like kind of obsessed with that. Like that's something I need to focus on a bit more at some point, but so what you understand. And you kind of see the sort of that side of it through some of those collections, but a lot of them is just you're actually lucky if you know who the manufacturer is. If it isn't stamped on it, it's kind of guesswork. Luckily, a lot of the manufacturers like to like show off who it was, but a lot of them don't come with stories attached from what I've seen so far, except from these few at the Science Museum where they've been actively repaired. I think you see a lot more, just to go back to the Second World War now, and I'm not focused on these as much in my thesis, but a lot of the collections and museums are from like POW camps where they've had to make their own legs with materials that were kind of available to them. So they've got stories attached, and obviously quite exciting, interesting stories attached to them because of the nature of where they were created. So I think they're really interesting. They don't come into my thesis because they're not, I'm looking at Britain, but again, love to do something more on that. But that's kind of where you're seeing a lot more of those sort of personal stories attached to it, because they or somebody in the camp made that limb.
I'm going to cheat here because that brings me very nicely onto a question I was really interested in. I didn't think we get a chance, but I'm going to throw it there anyway. When you mentioned that they got duplicate limbs and so on, this is obviously pre-NHS, and now we're mentioning people repairing their own What ongoing support is there? Is it, do they just, once Roehampton and stuff kind of go, is it just you're out on your own, manage as best you can? Or is there an ongoing debt paid to them?
So,
I've given you another topic for the post.
no, so my thesis is technically up to 1948 in the NHS. So I haven't looked at anything NHS onwards because that would be a nice other project to do at some point. I hope Mr. Fries aren't watching. So I mean, there's constant care throughout the sort of like the period before the NHS. You've also got the Ministry of Pensions, and there's constant sort of medical boards, and you're getting those payments. You obviously you will get your limb repaired if it needs repaired. You do get that duplicate limb to help you with that and stuff like that. So there is that sort of care there throughout and that support there. But once we actually get to that sort of proper idea of a welfare state with the NHS, I don't know what happens beyond that yet.
Quickly to Davina, yes. So similar question to we've had previously, but yeah, once they became an amputee, they go out of frontline service and occasionally maybe come back, but not in any sort of
they're not going back to like fight in the trenches.
But unfortunately, we're drawing to the end of the session, which is a shame because
I'm enjoying this.
well, the nice thing is that we can carry it on. During the stall still later on.
True.
But it's such an evocative topic and one that's so a war that still resonates in the public conscious lightly because of all these wounded men, broken men coming back. So thank you very much to Louise for giving us the talk today. Would you like to plug any forthcoming publications, social media outputs, anything like that anyone who's interested would like to find out more about?
No, I don't think I have anything coming up. I mean, if you want to follow me on Twitter, it's @LouBell, and you can find me on there. I do tweet about my work occasionally and anything exciting that's coming up there. So if Twitter still exists after this.
So thank you to Louise.
Thank you.
Thank you to Claire, somewhere behind the scenes, for taking care of the feed to YouTube. Thank you to Laurie, as you can see, providing on-hand technical support when things go wrong. But thank you to the audience for joining us today. We really appreciate it. If you do have any questions, comments, observations, please let us know. We want to do more of these. We want to do them better. Anything you spot that we can improve on, please let us know. Our talk next week comes from Dr. Alexander Lumsden of the University of St Andrews. He takes us to the early period of the Roman Republic and their Gallic opponents, looking at tactics, equipment, status, and hierarchy, and shedding some light on the way in which these early campaigns played out, and perhaps redeeming the reputation of quote-unquote barbarian tribes. For more details of that, check our website, which is royalarmies.org. Follow us on the social media we employ, including Twitter or whatever it's rebranded to. Or follow us on Eventbrite or YouTube. You'll get direct notifications of these events as we post them. But in the meantime, thank you again for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you next week.